Something happened on June 24th, 2026 that Microsoft did not put in a press release. There was no announcement, no emergency broadcast, no warning on your lock screen. But on that single date, a security mechanism built into the foundation of over 1 billion Windows PCs quietly began to collapse. And here is what no one is telling you. Your computer may still be turning on. It may still feel completely normal. But underneath the surface, the layer of protection that was the only thing standing between your machine and some of the most dangerous malware ever engineered is already gone. There's a particular kind of danger that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with alarms or error messages or a sudden system crash. It moves silently beneath the surface, invisible to every tool you have been trained to trust. And that is precisely what makes what happened on June 24th, 2026, one of the most consequential security events in the history of personal computing. Not because millions of PCs exploded overnight, but because millions of PCs quietly entered a permanent state of exposure that most of their owners will not discover until it is far too late. Let that sit for a moment. Because what most people are not seeing is that this is not a story about a hacker finding a loophole. This is a story about time running out on a promise that was made 15 years ago, a promise baked into the firmware of your motherboard, embedded so deep in the hardware of your machine that no antivirus software can see it, no Windows Update notification will fully explain it, and no amount of restarting your computer will fix it if the transition was missed. On June 24th, 2026, the first of Microsoft's original secure boot certificates, the Microsoft Corporation KEKCA 2011, officially expired. It was followed by the Microsoft UEFI CA 2011 just 3 days later on June 27th, and a third certificate, the Microsoft Windows Production PCA 2011, is set to follow on October 19th, 2026. Together, these three certificates have underpinned firmware-level boot trust on every UEFI-capable PC deployed since the Windows 8 era, more than 1 billion devices worldwide, including systems running Linux distributions. Read that number again, 1 billion devices. Not 1 billion users who are slightly inconvenienced. 1 billion machines that trusted a cryptographic handshake that has now structurally and permanently begun to dissolve. And here is where it gets worse. This is not the kind of story where something visibly breaks. Your PC will still start. Windows will still load. Your wallpaper will still appear. Your browser will still open. Your files will still be there. Everything will look exactly the same. A machine missing the 2023 certificates is not supposed to brick itself on June 24th. Microsoft was very deliberate about that. They did not want chaos. They did not want millions of people waking up to black screens. So instead, what they engineered was something far more insidious, a slow erosion, a quiet degradation of the most powerful layer of protection your PC has ever had, happening invisibly at the firmware level, in the part of your computer that loads before Windows even begins to breathe. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Secure Boot actually does, and why losing it is not merely an inconvenience. It is an open door to a category of malware so dangerous that even the most sophisticated antivirus programs cannot stop it once it is inside. Secure Boot is a security standard enforced by the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, the UEFI firmware. It ensures that only trusted software, signed with valid cryptographic keys, can execute during the boot process, protecting the system from rootkits, bootkits, and unauthorized operating systems. When a PC starts, the firmware checks the cryptographic signature of each boot component, such as the boot manager and the OS loader, against a set of certificates stored in a database. If the signatures are valid and the certificate chain is trusted, the boot process continues. Otherwise, the system halts. This is your last line of defense, not your firewall, not your antivirus, not your password. This, the invisible handshake that happens before Windows even knows you pressed the power button. And what happens when that handshake is no longer valid? What happens when the certificates that anchor that entire trust chain have expired and not been replaced? Your system will be unable to download new DBX revocation lists, leaving you permanently exposed to future bootkit malware. This lack of updates will impact feature releases as well. Microsoft confirmed that future full OS upgrades will eventually require the EFI partition to be signed with the 2023 certificate, but that is just the beginning. Think about what that means in practical terms. The DBX, the Forbidden Signatures database, is Microsoft's master blacklist of bootloaders and firmware components, known to be malicious. Every time a new bootkit is discovered, every time a new piece of firmware malware is identified in the wild, Microsoft adds it to that list, and your PC, connected to Windows Update, automatically downloads the update and blocks that malware from ever loading. That mechanism, for machines that missed the certificate transition, is now permanently broken, frozen, dead. Any bootkit discovered from this point forward will be added to a list that your machine can no longer receive. This is not chaos. This is a structural failure unfolding in slow motion. Now here's where the story gets deeper, because what happened on June 24th did not occur in isolation. It collided with something else, something that the cybersecurity community has been watching build for weeks with increasing alarm. Microsoft's June 2026 Patch Tuesday addressed 206 vulnerabilities, the highest single-month volume on record, including 39 critical severity flaws and 3 0 days that were publicly disclosed before patches were available. The presence of pre-disclosed 0 days and remote code execution vulnerabilities across core Microsoft products means unpatched systems carried active exploitation risk during the gap between disclosure and remediation. 206 vulnerabilities in a single month. That is not a Patch Tuesday. That is a siege. To put that number in context, this is the largest number of vulnerabilities ever disclosed in a single security update since Microsoft began the Patch Tuesday program 23 years ago in October 2003. 23 years of monthly security patches, and June 2026 just broke every record that existed. And it broke it, not by a small margin. The previous record was 175, set in October 2025, but by a gap so wide it suggests something has fundamentally shifted in the threat landscape surrounding Windows. What most people are not seeing is that this was not bad luck. This was not a statistical anomaly. This was the collision of two forces that have been building simultaneously: the growing sophistication of attackers and the structural vulnerability created by the expiration of foundational security architecture that should have been rotated years earlier. And here's where it gets considerably worse. Within this update, there were approximately 65 elevation of privilege vulnerabilities, with privilege escalation dominating this cycle. These vulnerabilities are frequently utilized by threat actors at the beginning of multi-stage attacks, chained with initial access exploits. 65 separate ways for an attacker who has gotten one foothold on your system to immediately escalate their access to full system control. 65 paths, from nuisance to catastrophe. And they do not need to find all 65. They need to find one that you have not patched. The only security vulnerability in this massive update package that is actively being exploited in the wild is the elevation of privilege vulnerability CVE 2026-4191 in Microsoft Defender. That sentence deserves its own moment of silence. The tool designed to protect you, Microsoft Defender, the built-in security software that hundreds of millions of Windows users rely on as their primary defense, contained a vulnerability being actively exploited in the wild before the patch was released. Attackers were already using it. They were already inside. And the scale of the exploitation prompted Microsoft to credit multiple independent researchers for reporting it, which, according to informed security analysts, typically indicates that the attacks had already become widespread enough for multiple parties to notice independently. But the Defender vulnerability, as alarming as it is only one thread in a much larger tapestry. There is also CVE 2026-47291 in the HTTP service, where an attacker can inject and execute code without needing to authenticate. There's also CVE 2026-44815 in the DHCP client service, which runs on all PCs, making it an attractive target for any attacker. And here too, an attacker can inject and execute code without having to authenticate. Let those words land properly. Without authentication. No username, no password, no social engineering required. An attacker on the same network as your machine can reach through the HTTP service or the DHCP client, services that run automatically on every Windows PC, and execute arbitrary code. This is not a theoretical risk. The DHCP client runs on your machine right now, as you read this, as you sleep, as you work. It has been running continuously since you last turned your PC on. There is also CVE 2026-50507, which allows an unauthorized attacker to bypass BitLocker with a physical attack. BitLocker is a built-in Windows security feature that encrypts your entire hard drive, securing your data from unauthorized access if your device is lost or stolen. However, this vulnerability could allow an attacker with physical access to bypass BitLocker device encryption and gain access to encrypted data. For enterprise environments, for businesses that rely on BitLocker as the cornerstone of their data security strategy. Laptops carried by executives, devices storing financial records, machines holding intellectual property. This is not a minor patch note. This is a fundamental breach in one of Windows' most trusted security promises. And this is where everything changes, because the Secure Boot certificate expiration and the record-breaking Patch Tuesday are not two separate stories. They are the same story, told from different angles, converging on the same point. The June 2026 update also permanently revokes the bootloader used by the Black Lotus malware, which could bypass Secure Boot entirely by exploiting a signed but vulnerable bootloader. That revocation is irreversible once applied, meaning that even if an attacker reinstalls an old signed bootloader, it will no longer pass validation. Black Lotus is not a hypothetical. It is one of the most sophisticated and dangerous pieces of firmware malware ever documented in the wild. A bootkit so advanced it could survive a Windows reinstallation, survive a hard drive replacement because it lives not in your operating system, but in the firmware layer beneath it. Microsoft has now permanently revoked its bootloader, but only for machines that received the June update. For machines that did not, for machines running on expired 2011 certificates, frozen in their ability to receive new DBX updates, Black Lotus and every bootkit that comes after it remains a viable threat indefinitely. Now, let us talk about the machines that are most exposed, because this is not a uniform risk. Some machines are protected, many are not. And the line between those two categories is sharper and more complex than most people realize. Starting with the April 2026 Windows update, the Windows Security app includes updated secure boot status information under device security that shows whether the new certificates have been applied successfully. Most systems will transition without problems, but there are some known trouble spots: older PCs with outdated firmware, some older UEFI firmware implementations that do not properly support the new certificates, PCs that bypassed Windows 11 requirements, and legacy BIOS systems that are not using secure boot at all. Think about what that means for the scale of the problem. Hundreds of millions of PCs were sold between 2012 and 2021 running the 2011 certificates. Many of those machines have never received a BIOS update from their manufacturer. Many of those machines are running in small businesses, in home offices, in schools, in hospitals, and government agencies, managed by people who have never heard of a secure boot certificate and would not know where to look for one. Microsoft's Security Response Center has been quiet about the deadline outside of technical channels, but the recent Ask Microsoft Anything session on Secure Boot broke that silence. Company engineers fielded questions from enterprise admins who are already seeing test devices behave unpredictably as they simulate a post-expiry environment. The prevailing message: do not assume your fleet will be fine just because Windows 11 boots. And there is a specific category of device that faces something even more severe than degraded protection. ARM-based devices running Windows on ARM tend to enforce secure boot more strictly and may refuse to boot entirely if the certificate is expired, potentially bricking the device until firmware is recovered. This is the scenario that mainstream coverage has largely glossed over. For a specific class of Windows machines, this is not slow erosion. This is a hard stop, a device that simply will not start. And the recovery process for ARM devices in a bricked secure boot state is not a simple fix. It requires firmware-level intervention that most ordinary users are completely unequipped to perform. But even for the machines that keep running normally, and most will, the consequences building silently beneath the surface should not be underestimated. The result for unpatched enterprise fleets is that BitLocker recovery keys could proliferate, Intune compliance policies will break, and attackers will find a widening window to implant pre-boot malware. For IT departments managing fleets of hundreds or thousands of devices, the administrative nightmare of a mass BitLocker recovery event triggered by degraded secure boot states is not a hypothetical edge case. It is a documented risk that Microsoft's own engineers have warned about explicitly. Every device that enters a non-compliant secure boot state changes the measurement that BitLocker uses to validate the system integrity. When that measurement changes, BitLocker demands its recovery key. At scale, that means a help desk flooded with calls, thousands of employees locked out of their machines simultaneously, each requiring a 48-digit recovery key retrieved from whatever backup system the organization was disciplined enough to maintain. Now consider something that adds yet another layer of urgency to everything described above. This deadline did not arrive without warning. The transition has been underway for years, but many IT administrators and individual users remain unaware of the implications. Microsoft began shipping updated certificates through Windows Update and firmware patches as early as 2023, but the sheer scale of the Windows ecosystem means a significant number of devices may miss the update window. Microsoft knew, the security community knew, the warnings were published, the documentation was written, the AMA sessions were held, the playbooks were posted on the tech community blog. The information was available, and yet, heading into June 24th, 2026, a substantial portion of the global Windows device fleet remained unprotected. Not because the information was hidden, because the Windows ecosystem is so vast, so fragmented, so layered with legacy hardware and unmanaged personal devices and small business machines that have never been touched by a professional IT administrator, that even a multi-year, well-documented transition can still leave tens of millions of devices behind. What most people are not seeing is that this is a systemic problem, not a user failure. The architecture of the personal computing world, built on backward compatibility, built on the promise that hardware will keep working for years beyond its intended life cycle, is fundamentally at war with modern security requirements. Security requires constant renewal. Hardware endures, And at the intersection of those two realities, you find exactly the situation that arrived on June 24th. A cryptographic trust mechanism issued in 2011, running unchanged through 15 years of threat evolution, reaching its expiration date while still embedded in the firmware of hundreds of millions of active devices. And the implications extend further than Windows. Linux distributions are equally exposed. Nearly every mainstream Linux distro, Ubuntu, Fedora, Debian, RHEL, and others, uses Microsoft's UEFI CA 2011 to sign the shim first stage bootloader that enables those systems to boot with Secure Boot enabled. The Fedora project confirmed that once the 2011 key expires, any new shim binaries will only be signed with the 2023 key. This means Linux installation media relying on a new shim signed with the 2023 key will fail to boot on machines whose firmware only contains the old 2011 certificates. A direct impact on bare metal installs, server deployments, and VM templates across enterprise environments. This is not a Windows story. This is not a Microsoft story. This is an infrastructure story. The certificates that expired on June 24th were load-bearing elements of the global computing trust architecture, embedded not just in Windows machines, but in the data centers, the servers, the cloud infrastructure that the modern digital economy depends on. According to informed security professionals, the most dangerous period is not the day the certificates expire. It is the months and years that follow. Because as the global Windows fleet diverges, some machines carrying the new 2023 trust chain, others frozen on the expiring 2011 infrastructure, a permanent asymmetry develops in the attack surface. Machines with the new certificates continue to receive bootloader revocations, continue to be protected against newly discovered firmware malware, continue to evolve with the threat landscape. Machines without it are locked in amber, unable to receive new protections, permanently vulnerable to any bootkit or firmware malware discovered after June 2026. And that gap will only widen. Every new threat that emerges, every new bootkit that security researchers uncover, every new firmware vulnerability that gets added to the DBX blacklist widens the gulf between the protected and the unprotected. The unprotected machines do not get worse on the day the certificates expire. They get worse every day that follows. Your system will be unable to download new DBX revocation lists, leaving you permanently exposed to future bootkit malware. Microsoft confirmed that future full OS upgrades will eventually require the EFI partition to be signed with the 2023 certificate, although the upcoming Windows 11 26H2 will still install normally. If your device lacks the certificates, the Windows installer will intentionally fail the upgrade process to prevent putting your system into an unbootable state. Read that carefully. Microsoft will eventually make it impossible to upgrade your operating system if you have not completed the certificate transition. The protection mechanism will become a prerequisite for staying current. And machines that cannot complete the transition because their OEM never released a compatible firmware update, because their hardware is too old, because their BIOS predates UEFI entirely, will eventually be stranded on older Windows versions, unable to move forward, increasingly left outside the perimeter of Microsoft's security ecosystem. Now, against all of this, what does Microsoft's record-breaking June patch release actually mean? The leading risk types by exploitation technique in June 2026 are elevation of privilege with 65 patches, representing 32%, remote code execution with 55 patches, representing 27%, and information disclosure with 29 patches, representing 13%. These three categories together account for nearly 3/4 of the entire patch release. Privilege escalation, remote code execution, information disclosure. In practical terms, those three categories translate to attackers getting in, attackers taking control, and attackers taking your data. And the most alarming element of that distribution is not the raw numbers. It is the implication. 65 privilege escalation vulnerabilities in a single month does not mean 65 isolated problems. It means 65 chains waiting to be assembled. An attacker who achieves initial access through a phishing email, a malicious link, a compromised Wi-Fi network, can chain any one of those escalation paths to move from a limited foothold to full system control in a single coordinated attack. A total of 6 0 days were addressed in this cycle. 5 were publicly disclosed prior to patching, and 1 is actively exploited in the wild. 5 vulnerabilities were publicly known before Microsoft had a patch ready. 5 windows during which the knowledge of how to exploit those vulnerabilities existed in the world was being discussed in forums and security briefings and threat intelligence feeds while the patch did not yet exist. 5 periods of unavoidable exposure. This is the reality of the modern vulnerability economy. By the time a CVE number is published, the information is already moving through communities that Microsoft has no control over. The race between patch release and exploit development is not theoretical. It is happening in real time, every cycle. And June 2026 was a cycle where that race was run across more finish lines simultaneously than ever before in the history of Patch Tuesday. And here is something the mainstream technology press has largely failed to connect. The secure boot deadline and the record patch release did not merely coincide on the calendar. They converged at the exact same moment in the security posture of Windows devices worldwide. A machine that has not received the 2023 Secure Boot certificates is a machine that cannot reliably receive future boot level protections. A machine drowning in 206 unpatched vulnerabilities, because its owner has not applied the June update, is a machine sitting in a rapidly expanding attack surface. Now combine those two conditions. A device that missed the secure boot transition and has not been patched for June 2026 is carrying expired firmware trust architecture and actively exploitable vulnerabilities in Defender, in HTTP.slice, in the DHCP client, in BitLocker, in the Windows kernel, in Hyper-V, in Exchange Server, in Microsoft Office. That is not a vulnerable machine, that is an invitation. The real story is that we have reached a moment where the cumulative weight of 15 years of backward compatibility assumptions, firmware complexity, fragmented update delivery, and exponentially growing attack surfaces has converged into a single point of structural crisis for the Windows ecosystem. Microsoft did not create this crisis maliciously or carelessly. The 2011 certificates had to expire eventually. Cryptographic assets are not designed to last forever, and 15 years is already an extraordinarily long life cycle for a root certificate in a high-stakes security context. The 2023 replacements are valid until 2038. The engineers who designed the transition built tools, wrote documentation, hosted AMAs, deployed Windows update mechanisms to automate the process. The machinery of the transition was real and serious. But the machinery collided with the reality of a billion-device ecosystem in which firmware update delivery is inconsistent, in which OEM support life cycles vary enormously, in which small businesses and individual users operate machines that have not seen a BIOS update since they were purchased, in which the very features that made Windows ubiquitous, the compatibility, the longevity, the promise that your hardware would keep working, create the exact conditions in which a security transition of this magnitude can never be fully complete before the deadline arrives. The secure boot deadline is not the day billions of PCs fail. It is the day the industry loses the luxury of pretending firmware trust can be set once and ignored forever. That sentence should be printed somewhere prominent in every IT department in the world, because it describes not just June 24th, 2026, but the fundamental challenge facing every organization that depends on Windows infrastructure for the foreseeable future. Certificate rotation is not a one-time event. It is going to be a recurring reality. The 2023 certificates expire in 2038. Microsoft has already signaled that a post-quantum cryptography transition is planned for around 2030 for future hardware. The cadence is tightening, the complexity is increasing, and the window between the issuance of a certificate and its expiration is already shorter than the typical life cycle of enterprise hardware in many organizations. What does that mean for the next 12 months? The October 19th, 2026 expiry of the Windows Production PCA 2011 provides a secondary deadline, but organizations relying on the KEK and UFICA certificates have already passed their window. There is another cliff coming. October 19th, another certificate. Another category of machines that will cross from protected to permanently frozen if the transition is not completed before that date. And the machines that are already behind, the ones that missed June 24th, will compound their exposure with each passing week. Each new bootkit discovered, each new DBX update they cannot receive, each new Windows feature release that their degraded secure boot state makes impossible to install. What most people are not seeing is that the question is no longer whether your machine is exposed. For hundreds of millions of devices worldwide, that question was answered on June 24th, 2026. The question now is how deep the exposure goes, how quickly attackers will move to exploit the permanent gap in DBX update capability, how many businesses will discover their Intune compliance policies are broken before they discover why, how many individuals will spend years using a machine that appears completely normal while quietly becoming more vulnerable with every passing month. The question is whether the next major bootkit campaign, the next Black Lotus, the next firmware level threat that makes traditional antivirus software irrelevant, arrives before or after the organizations and individuals who missed the transition finally realize what they lost on June 24th. The clock that ran out on June 24th was not a countdown to disaster on a single day. It was the closing of a window that can never be fully reopened. The certificates are expired. The DBX updates have stopped for unpatched machines. The record-breaking June patch cycle has shipped. The next Patch Tuesday is scheduled for July 14th, 2026, and whatever vulnerabilities it addresses, Whatever 0 days it patches, whatever critical remote code execution flaws it closes, the machines that cannot receive boot-level protections will carry a growing shadow beneath every other update they successfully install. So the questions that remain are not comfortable ones. How many machines missed the transition? How many businesses are running on firmware trust architecture that expired this week and don't know it yet? How many of the 206 vulnerabilities patched in June will be chained with the boot-level exposure to produce attacks that no security tool below the firmware layer can detect? How long before the asymmetry between protected and unprotected Windows machines becomes so pronounced that attackers begin specifically targeting the latter? And perhaps most fundamentally, if this is what a certificate expiration looks like at the scale of 1 billion devices, with years of preparation, and harnessing full Microsoft engineering support, automated update delivery, and still leaving tens of millions of machines behind, what does the 2030 post-quantum cryptography transition look like? What does 2038 look like? Something much larger than a deadline just passed. And the full weight of what was lost on June 24th, 2026 has not yet begun to be felt.